The Lost Civilization Enigma, a new inquiry into the existence of ancient cities, cultures, and peoples who predate recorded history. By Philip Coppens. Narrated by David Drummond. Copyright 2013 by Philip Coppens. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with New Page Books, a division of Career Press, and was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Introduction. Is history as the history books teach us? Or is civilization, when humanity began to cultivate plants, work metals, build monuments, and live in organized settlements, far more complex and older than we assume? As a 10-year-old child in school, my teacher taught that Greece was the cradle of civilization, even though in 1981 it was obvious that this was no longer the case. Egypt and Sumer were known to be far older civilizations, but somehow the textbooks used in Belgian schools had not caught up with facts. 30 years later, the situation has somewhat changed, but the criticism leveled at textbook historians remains. There reigns a paradigm that even though we no longer believe that God created the world in 4004 BC, we still assume that civilization could not possibly have existed previously. Before 4000 BC, it is widely assumed, our ancestors were pretty much savages. That is simply not the case. The latest archaeological findings have pushed the boundaries of civilization much further back, to 10,000 BC, with sites such as Jericho and most recently Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. The existence of Jericho and Çatalhöyük has been known for decades and has been dated to 8000 BC, but I challenge you to open your child's school books or any popular book on archaeology and find a reference to these cities in there. The few archaeological publications that do treat these sites as stand-alone pockets of civilization, even though they are all situated within hundreds of miles of each other. The obvious answer seems to be that they were part of one culture, but no such argument is explored by scientists. When it comes to truly lost civilizations, such as the lost civilization of Atlantis, historians even ridicule anyone considering making a scientific study of it. They argue that Plato created an idealized society rather than report a historical account, for the historians know there was no such civilization in existence in 10,000 BC. It simply cannot be. What they fail to report is that Plato wrote about Atlantis in a book solely devoted to history, and that when skeptics in his own time went to Egypt to discredit him, they instead returned with verification that Egyptian columns indeed contained the story of Atlantis, as Plato had reported. It shows, at the very least, that the ancient Egyptians believed in a lost civilization of Atlantis. In short, it shows that the theory cherished by historians is simply wrong. There is even evidence that signs of civilization, tools, objects, and legends are tens of thousands, even millions of years old. American author Michael Cremo cataloged hundreds of examples in a book he titled Forbidden Archaeology. It was his conclusion that such objects were deemed to be a no-go zone by archaeologists, as it would upset everything we have assumed to be true about our history. But that legends were factual was proven in the 19th century, when Heinrich Schliemann showed that Troy was not just a fable invented by the ancient Greeks, but a veritable city. The myths had proven to be true. In fact, there is good evidence that many of the reports of lost civilizations have always had a foundation in truth and reality. For many centuries, chroniclers doubted the existence of civilizations in the depths of the Amazon rainforest. But today, science is admitting its errors and acknowledges satellite imagery has revealed the traces of this lost civilization. Other claims of lost civilizations, such as Mu, remain outside of the reach of both archaeologists and explorers, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist. As the saying goes, the absence of available evidence doesn't mean it is evidence of its absence. Apart from slowly rediscovering lost civilizations, new dimensions of known civilizations are discovered on an almost daily basis. Yet each time the boundaries of civilization are pushed back or expanded, the messengers of this new information are attacked. When the enigmatic Antikythera device was discovered off the coasts of Greece in 1900, it took many decades before it was recognized as an astronomical clock, a device that was able to graphically show the position of the sun, moon, planets, and certain stars. Dating to ancient Greece, it is now heralded as the world's first computer, but most of the research into the device has been done by rebel archaeologists, who were often ferociously attacked by their colleagues for even considering this might be what it eventually turned out to be. Most recently, this antagonism to expanding the scope of ancient civilizations has been most apparent in the controversy surrounding the so-called Bosnian pyramids. The pyramid complex outside the town of Visoko, near the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, would merely show that a civilization known as Old Europe, which blossomed between circa 5500 and 3000 BC, built pyramids. As Old Europe was in any other way on par with the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations, why it would therefore not be able to build pyramids is strange. But since the discovery of these pyramids in 2005, science ferociously tries to maintain the existing paradigm, even threatening archaeologists not to partake in the excavations. Otherwise, they will never work at other archaeological sites ever again. The historical timeline, it seems, cannot be answered. Historians seem to cherish the dawn date of 4000 BC far dearer than the Church ever did. There is also evidence that at least in Bronze Age Europe, circa 3000 BC, there was contact between America and Europe. Whereas we like to believe that it took the dawn of the 21st century for the first global civilization and economy, at least these two continents were very much working economically together 5,000 years ago. Our ancestors knew more than we give them credit for, and the Antikythera device is but one example of this. Florence and Kenneth Wood have identified a secret code that resides within Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The Greek myths contain detailed stellar information, showing that the story has a layer that conveys quite advanced astronomical knowledge, including an understanding of the precession of the equinoxes, a discovery science is not willing to credit our ancestors with that far back. Most recently, analysis of the construction of Göbekli Tepe has shown that it incorporates astronomical concepts, for example, depictions of some constellations. This shows that our ancestors, 12,000 years ago, had already mapped the stars and were aware of at least the most basic concepts of astronomy, but likely much more. This latter conclusion can be reached when we realize that the cave paintings in Lascaux, France, date back 20,000 years and also incorporate astronomical knowledge. Lascaux is not a cave where our ancestors drew some scenes of their daily hunting lifestyle, but was a religious sanctuary containing the sacred knowledge of our times. The cave paintings have survived, but every other aspect of this civilization has disappeared, become lost to us. Our history is far more interesting, far older, and more impressive than the standard textbooks and history books present us. A Neolithic tomb at Boutier-Boulancourt, near Paris, contains the body of a man whose arm had been surgically and expertly amputated 5,900 years ago. Known civilizations, such as the Greeks, had objects that were able to visualize the orbits of the sun, the moon, and the planets. Known archaeological discoveries, like Jericho and Göbekli Tepe, show civilization is many thousands of years older than first thought. Adding lost civilizations, such as Atlantis, to this new image is merely another chapter in the story of civilization. In the New World, too, what the Spanish conquistadors found is far more complex and far more developed than we give the early inhabitants of America credit for. The resulting picture is that civilization as we know it is not 6,000 years old, but at least 12,000 years old, and that our ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, were already crafting tools and objects, it is definitely obvious that our civilization is not the first. What was there before? What has been lost and is waiting to be rediscovered? Chapter 1. The New Inquisition. Many of us live with the idea that science is about expanding the horizons of our knowledge, boldly thinking where no one has thought before. However, in truth, that is rarely the case. There are very few Indiana Joneses out there. Science has expressed no interest at all in the Ark of the Covenant or crystal skulls, even though the first object was the center of the Jewish religion and the latter at the heart of the Mayan religion. Instead, scientists have labeled crystal skulls modern fabrications, while they show no interest at all in recovering lost objects like the Ark. When it comes to lost civilizations, all the evidence shows that science is dogmatic and is unwilling to even listen to the arguments presented in favor of their existence. Those who claim to have found evidence are accused of being unscientific, whether they are amateur or professional scientists, and are told the discovery simply cannot be, as science knows it is impossible. These days, science has no problem proclaiming they are all-knowing when it comes to these subjects. In the 1999 BBC documentary Atlantis Uncovered, Dr. Kenneth L. Feder, a professor of archaeology at Central Connecticut State University, stated, "When we come to something like the lost continent of Atlantis, we are better off knowing that civilizations developed more or less independently, just so nobody can say some people are better than others, some are smarter than others, because we know what happens down the line when we believe that. So I'm not going to tell you that belief in Atlantis is necessarily the first step toward genocide or Holocaust, but what I'm telling you is we are on a very slippery slope if we believe in fantasies, and that those fantasies lead us down to places we really don't want to go." Feder, in essence, argues that discussions about Atlantis, as well as discussions that civilizations traded and helped each other in their development, is a very slippery slope and a fantasy, and though he tells us not to immediately draw a comparison with genocide, he does draw that comparison. Seriously, Dr. Feder? Science, it seems, is always more about preserving the status quo of what we already know than truly about expanding our boundaries of knowledge. Indeed, the evidence shows that the halls of academia are very much like the New Inquisition. They have not yet burned people at the stake, but they have thrown people in jail and destroyed the careers of those who tried to challenge the scientific dogma. The heretics are especially those who have tried to argue the case for the existence of lost civilizations, or accidentally stumbled upon evidence that would upset the reigning paradigm. Such accidents often have had disastrous results for the innocent parties involved. Archaeological trench warfare. The excavations near the French village of Glozelle, a hamlet located 10 miles from the French spa town of Vichy, are among the most controversial of archaeological endeavors ever recorded. These excavations lasted between 1924 and 1938, but the vast majority of finds, more than 3,000 artifacts, were unearthed in the first 2 years. The artifacts were variously dated to Neolithic, Iron Age, and medieval times. That in itself was not controversial. It is how one eventually arrived at these dates that reveals a saga of archaeological feuding and fraud versus truth. Glozelle has been described as the Dreyfus affair of French archaeology, and the Dreyfus equivalent was Émile Fredin, a 17-year-old who, together with his grandfather Claude Fredin, stepped into history on March 1, 1924. Working in a farming field known as Duranton, Émile was holding the handles of a plow when one of the cows pulling it stuck its foot in a cavity. Freeing the cow, the Fredins uncovered a cavity containing human bones and ceramic fragments. So far, this could have been just any usual archaeological discovery, of which some are made every week. That soon changed. It is said that the first to arrive the following day to see what the farmers had unearthed were the neighbors. They not only found, but also took some of the objects. From there, the news spread around the village. That same month, Adrien Picandet, a local teacher, visited the Fredins' farm and decided to inform the Minister of Education. On July 9th, Benoit Clément, another teacher, this time from the neighboring village, and representing La Société d'Émulation du Bourbonnais, visited the site and later returned with a man called Viple. Clément and Viple used pickaxes to break down the remaining walls, which they took away with them. Some weeks later, Émile Fredin received a letter from Viple, in which the latter identified the site as dating from Gallo-Roman times, 1st to 4th centuries A.D. He added that he felt that the site was of little interest. His advice was to recommence cultivation of the field, which is precisely what the Fredin family did. This might, therefore, have been the end of the saga, but not so. The January 1925 Bulletin de la Société d'Émulation du Bourbonnais reported on the findings. It brought the story to the attention of Antonin Morlet, a Vichy physician and amateur archaeologist. Morlet visited Clément and was intrigued by the findings. Morlet was an amateur specialist in the Gallo-Roman period and believed that the objects from Glozelle were older. He thought that some might even date from the Magdalenian period, 12,000 to 9,500 BC, which would make them extraordinarily old and one of the most important archaeological finds ever in France. Both Morlet and Clément visited the farm and the field on April 26, 1925, and Morlet offered the Fredins 200 francs per year to be allowed to complete the excavation. The family accepted. Morlet began his excavations on May 24, 1925, discovering tablets, idols, bone and flint tools, and engraved stones. This material allowed him to identify the site as Neolithic. He published his Nouvelle Station Néolithique in September 1925, listing Émile Fredin as co-author. He argued that the site was, as the title of the article states, Neolithic in nature. Though Morlet dated it as Neolithic, he was not blind to see that the site contained objects from various epochs. He still upheld his belief that some artifacts appeared to be older, belonging to the Magdalenian period, but added that the techniques that had been used appeared to be Neolithic. As such, he identified Glozelle as a transition site between both eras, even though it was known that the two eras were separated by several millennia. Certain objects were indeed anachronistic. One stone showed a reindeer, accompanied by letters that appeared to be an alphabet. The reindeer vanished from that region around 10,000 BC, yet the earliest known form of writing at that time was believed to have been established around 3300 BC, and that was in the Middle East. The general consensus was that for the Glozelle region, one would have to wait a further 3 millennia before writing was introduced. Worse, the script appeared to be comparable with the Phoenician alphabet, dated to circa 1000 BC, or to the Iberian script, which was derived from it. But, of course, it was known that no Phoenician colony could have been located in Glozelle, so rather than explain the site, it made the site even harder to understand. But what Morlet had shown was that rather than a site that seemed to have little or no importance, Glozelle was a site that would upset the world of archaeology. Whereas he might have thought he was going to rewrite history and the story of how civilization evolved, it was, in truth, a time bomb, which would soon explode. When news of the discovery reached them, it should not come as a wonder that French archaeological academics were dismissive of Dr. Morlet's report. After all, it was published by an amateur, a medical doctor, and a peasant boy, who perhaps could not even write properly. In their opinion, the amateurism dripped off their conclusion, for it challenged their carefully established and vociferously defended dogma on several levels. Prehistoric writing? A crossover between a Paleolithic and a Neolithic civilization? Nonsense! And hence, the halls of academia began to attack the conclusions Morlaix had reached, as they were simply impossible. One person claimed that the artifacts had to be fakes, as some of the tablets were discovered at a depth of 5 inches. Indeed, if that were the case, they would indeed be fakes. But the problem is that all the tablets were found at substantial depths. It is evidence of how the academics manipulated the facts, as the facts didn't fit the dogma. They were trying to explain Glozell away, rather than explain Glozell. It should be noted that the 5 inches argument continues to be used by several skeptics to this day, who falsely continue to assume it is true. Unfortunately for French academic circles, Morlaix was not one to lie down easily, and today his ghost continues to hang, if not watch, over Glozell. Morlaix invited a number of archaeologists to visit the site during 1926. They included Salomon Reinach, curator of the Musée d'Archéologie Nationale de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, who spent 3 days excavating. Reinach confirmed the authenticity of the site in a communication to the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres. Even higher academic circles descended on the site. The famous archaeologist Abbé Breuil excavated with Morlaix and was impressed with the site. In late 1926, he wrote 2 articles in which Breuil stated that the authenticity of the Glozell site was incontestable. Breuil had also worked together with prehistorian André Vaison de Pradines, who had visited the site under an assumed name and attempted to buy the artifacts from Pradines. When Pradines refused, Vaison de Pradines became angry and threatened to destroy the site. Under his own name, he obtained permission to excavate from Dr. Morlaix, but then claimed to have detected Pradines spreading salt in the excavation trench. Was Vaison de Pradines keeping his promise that he would destroy the site? Morlaix chose to attack, and he challenged Vaison de Pradines to duplicate what Pradines had allegedly done. When he was unable to do so, or find where Pradines had supposedly salted the trench, Morlaix felt he had successfully dealt with that impostor. He was wrong. Vaison de Pradines' allegation made it into print, and the heat of the Glozell affair intensified, despite several leading scientists found in favor of its authenticity. At first, Breuil tried to remain neutral, but it would be a reindeer that soured the relationship between Breuil and Morlaix, as Breuil had identified an engraved animal on a tablet as a cervid, neither reindeer nor elk. Morlaix, however, had received confirmation from Professor August Brinkmann, director of the zoology department at Bergen Museum, Norway, and informed Breuil of his mistake. It was the moment when Breuil changed his attitude in the Glozell debate. But rather than talk, which is what his attackers were doing, Morlaix dug, unearthing throughout a period of 2 years 3,000 objects, all of varied forms and shape, including 100 tablets carrying signs and approximately 15 tablets carrying the imprints of human hands. Other discoveries included 2 tombs, sexual idols, polished stones, dressed stones, ceramics, glass, bones, and so on. Surely these could not be fakes, as archaeologists were saying. Who would make thousands of artifacts? His attackers were straightforward in naming their suspect, Pradines. Breuil was more open-minded than his colleagues, but it is apparent that he did not like to be proven wrong in the case of his cervid. So, rather than admit his mistake, instead, he drifted further and further in the ranks of those intent on discrediting Glozell, for no other reason than if Morlaix's findings were true, the site would be thousands of years older than they thought it could be, and, more importantly, than they had said in print. On August 2, 1927, Breuil reiterated that he wanted to stay away from the site. On October 2nd, he wrote that everything is false except the stoneware pottery. Just before that, at the meeting of the International Institute of Anthropology in Amsterdam, held in September 1927, the Glozell site was the subject of heated controversy, so much so that a commission was appointed to conduct further investigation. Its membership was largely comprised of people who had already decided the Glozell finds were fraudulent. Among the group was British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod, who had studied with Broglie. The commissioners arrived at Glozell on November 5, 1927. During their excavations, several members found artifacts. But on the third day, Morlaix saw commission members Dorothy Garrod, Abbé Favre, and Mr. Émile Landrin slip under the barbed wire and set off toward the open trench before he had opened the gate of the excavation site. Morlaix followed Garrod and saw that she stuck one of her fingers into the plaster pattern on the side of the trench, making a hole. He shouted out, reprimanding her for what she had just done. Caught in the act, she at first denied it, but in the presence of her two colleagues, as well as the attorney Malat and a scientific journalist, Tricot-Royer, she had to admit she had made the hole. This was clearly a smoking gun. A leading archaeologist had been caught trying to falsify an archaeological excavation. But what happened? It was agreed they would not speak about the incident, showing the gracious nature of all men involved toward Miss Garrod. However, Morlaix did speak about it after the commission had published its unfavorable report. This might be seen as mudslinging, trying to get back at the commission, but unfortunately for those willing to adhere to this theory, a photograph exists that attests to the incident having occurred. In it, Garrod is hiding behind the four men, who are in heated discussion about what she had just done. Most importantly, Tricot-Royer and Malat also gave written testimony confirming Morlaix's account. What was Garrod trying to do? Some have claimed it was merely an accident, but it is remarkable that she was part of a posse that entered the site. In essence, they broke in before the official start of the day and had an accident that could have been interpreted as evidence of someone interfering with the excavation. If others had found that the excavation had been tampered with, fingers would not have been pointed at Garrod, but instead at Fredin, whom the archaeologists suspected of being the forger, burying artifacts in the ground, only to have amateur archaeologists like Morlaix, who did not know better, discover them. If this suggestion, that Fredin had entered the site at night, had been made, it would have resulted in a case closed, and the Glozell artifacts would have been qualified as fraudulent. Fortunately, Garrod and company were caught in the act. However, the incident did not cause any harm to Dorothy Garrod's career. She went on to teach a generation of British archaeologists at Cambridge. Perhaps unremarkably, she made sure to tell all of them that the Glozell artifacts were fakes, and several of her students echoed her informed opinion. The list included Glyn Daniel and Colin Renfrew, both fervent critics of the Glozell finds. We can only wonder whether the finger incident is known to these modern pillars of archaeology. Decades later, when the skeptical archaeologists were challenged with evidence that thermoluminescence and carbon dating had shown that the Glozell artifacts could not be forgeries created by Fredin, Renfrew wrote in 1975, "The three papers, taken together, suggest strongly that the pottery and terracotta objects from Glozell, including the inscribed tablets, should be regarded as genuine, and with them, presumably, the remainder of the material. I still find it beyond my powers of imagination to take Glozell entirely seriously." So let us get this right. Though all the archaeological evidence suggested the site was genuine, Renfrew's emotions, and especially his powers of imagination, prevented him from taking it seriously. That is, of course, not science, but simply evidence of the fact that Renfrew is a bad scientist. He cannot accept hard scientific facts. It is precisely this attitude that has prevented archaeologists from addressing the issue of lost civilizations. But back to the past. Morlaix sent a letter to Mercure de France, published on November 15, 1927, still upset with Broglie's qualification of the site as a fake, and having spotted one of his students sticking an unwanted finger into an archaeological trench. "From the time your article appeared, I declared to anyone who wanted to listen, especially to your friends, so that you would hear about it, that I would not allow you to present a site already studied at length as a discovery which had not been described before you wrote about it.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?